The views, opinions, and content provided by our host and guests are just that, opinions and views that are not intended to malign any group, religion, business, individual, or thing. That said, please know that many of the stories shared and topics we discuss on this podcast contain disturbing or emotional content, which may be triggering. As I mentioned on my social media accounts, I basically come with a triggering content warning, but with lots of love and compassion. This podcast is conducted in a long-form interview style with the hope of capturing some of the deeper considerations and details around survivors' stories. We also hope to help those on the outside who are caring about survivors in a group of high demand, high control, by sharing their perspective and struggles, and also expert voices intended to help us unpack some of the complicated considerations around topics related to cults. Welcome to Season 2 of the Project Hope podcast. I am your host, Jennifer. As many of you know, I am a cult survivor myself. I got out of this group in 2012, and for anyone interested, you can hear the story of how I got in and how I got out in Season 1, Episodes 1 and 2. I now work with survivors of coercive control. I am not a psychotherapist. I have a master's in the psychology of coercive control and have been trained specifically in areas of expertise that will support survivors of coercive control. You're welcome to check out my credentials and offerings at jennifer-french.com. And I'm going to take a moment here to define this term coercive control, as one of my heart's desires is to help society at large better understand coercive control in cases that are not just culty, but across the globe. I view coercive control as a societal issue, a human rights issue. It's at the heart of cases where women and girls are murdered. We find coercive control in one-to-one relationships that are intimate, in gangs, sex trafficking, and cults of all types. Coercive control is a strategic pattern of behavior designed to exploit, control, create dependency, and dominate. The victim's everyday existence is micromanaged, and their space for action, as well as potential as a human being, is limited and controlled by the abuser. Initially, the victim may be drawn into the relationship with love bombing and charm. Gaslighting, isolation, economic control, and financial abuse can take place alongside rules and regulations that are gradually introduced over time and change at the whim of the abuser. The victim knows there are consequences if rules are broken, and they apply to the victim rather than the perpetrator, creating a double standard. Over time, coercively controlling behavior erodes the victim's sense of self, their confidence, self-esteem, agency, and autonomy. The abuser creates an unreal world of contradiction, confusion, and fear. It is helpful to know that 51% of victims do not even know that they are being abused, manipulated, and controlled. Coercive control correlates significantly to serious harm, and in cases of intimate partner violence, it precedes homicide. These can be difficult topics to grapple with, so I truly hope that this podcast helps to protect you and those you love with helpful voices and information. If you appreciate the podcast, please let us know, subscribe and comment with kindness. Think critically, trust your gut, and be free. In this part 1 of our 2-part interview, you will be introduced to Pat Ryan and Joe Kelly, who have been working since the 80s to help families and individuals as cult mediation specialists. Some of you may recognize this title as a newer version of a role that was once referred to as exit counseling, or those who work intimately with families and their loved ones with the hope of helping an individual in an unhealthy, harmful group decide to leave on their own impetus. So their philosophy is to help families and friends understand and effectively respond to the complexity of a loved one's cult involvement. Their approach emphasizes careful strategy, education, and more about this can be found on their website at cultmediation.com. In this interview, you will hear them share the stories that led them to this work, alongside how intertwined their stories are, from the gurus they loved and left, to the role that a legal case played in their educational process. They carry decades of wisdom and have been at the forefront of this work, now providing ethical guidelines to help others serve this niche. So I'll introduce you to their more formal bios. Jospeh Kelly is a graduate of Temple University with a focus in religion and has been a cult intervention specialist, also thought reform consultant, exit counselor, mediator since 1989. He spent 14 years in 2 different Eastern meditation groups, TM or Transcendental Meditation, and the International Society of Divine Love. He is a co-author of, quote, Ethical Standards for Thought Reform Consultants, which was published in the International Cultic Study Association's journal. And I'll also refer to that organization as ICSA moving forward. Joe contributed to a chapter to Captive Hearts, Captive Minds, another book. And he was the news desk editor of ICSA Today from 2010 to 2014. Joe also has facilitated ICSA workshops for ex-members and families and has lectured extensively on cult-related topics. And I would say that's an understatement. So Pat Ryan is the founder and former head of the TM-X, the organization of ex-members of Transcendental Meditation. He established ICSA's online resource from 1995 to 2013 and was editor of AFF News, a news publication for former cult members, which was in existence from 1995 to 1998. He has contributed to the Cult Observer, AFF's book, Recovery from Cults, and is co-author of Ethical Standards for Thought Reform Consultants. He has presented 50 programs about hypnosis, inner experience, trance induction techniques, communicating with cult members, conversion, cult intervention, exit counseling, intervention assessment, mediation, religious conflict resolution, thought reform consultation, Eastern groups, transcendental meditation, and workshops for educators, families, former members, and mental health professionals at ICSA workshops and conferences. Pat has also received the AFF Achievement Award in 1997 and the Leo J. Ryan Distinguished Service Award in 1999 from the Leo J. Ryan Foundation. He also received a Lifetime Achievement Award in 2011 from ICSA. So the resumes of Pat and Joe are impressive, but I think what has most impacted me personally is feeling the generosity they have extended to me as perhaps an extension of the respect and care with which they approach those they are helping. I hope you enjoy. So welcome, Pat Ryan and Joe Kelly, to the Project Hope podcast. It's such a delight to have the two of you with us today.
Our pleasure.
I'm so glad to be here.
Thank you. So I thought we would just begin to kind of ground the audience a little bit into a tiny bit of your history, kind of what engaged you in curiosity around, as we fondly call it, the cultiverse. And if you would each just share a little bit about that history.
Sure. So my experience starts in high school. So 1975, long time ago. I wrote for my high school newspaper and for a local newspaper in St. Petersburg, Florida. And Maharishi Master Yogi appeared on the Merv Griffin show with Grandma Walton and Clint
Grandma
Eastwood.
Walton.
Yeah, Grandma Walton, Clint Eastwood, I think Mary Tyler Moore.
Tyler Moore.
They were talking on the show about how TM could help lower blood pressure and those types of things. So the editor asked me to go write a story about this. So I went to the local TM center. I'm from St. Petersburg, Florida, and the Philadelphia Phillies spring train next door in Clearwater. And so the person who I went to hear the lecture, I walked in and there was these famous athletes that were learning TM. And so I myself took the course. And in my high school, there was a TM club. TM was taught in the school systems in New Jersey, Kansas, and California, different schools. And so I took the course and I enjoyed it. I had a good time. I was invited to go by the teachers who were all in their, I was 17. They were 25, 30, 35. They invited me to go on a week-long course. And so I went to that course, and that course was taught by Mia Farrow's sister, Prudence Bruns. Prudence is the person that the Beatles song "Dear Prudence, Won't You Come Out and Play" is about. So Prudence's husband was the Florida State coordinator for TM, and he was the recruiter for Maharishi International University, the TM Movement's university in Fairfield, Iowa. So at the end of that course, I came home and told my parents I was not going to the University of Florida, but I would be going to Maharishi International University. And that didn't go over great. My dad was from South Dakota. His parents homesteaded a farm. He was a high-ranking military guy. And, this just wasn't in the plan for his son. But he recognized that if he didn't go along with the program, he would lose me. So my parents paid for me to go to the TM Movement University, which is accredited university through the PhD level. Academically, not a bad school. But
and do you mind me asking there, Pat, so when you say that he had a sense that he was going to lose you if he didn't okay it, was that because you were already very gung-ho and...
More than gung-ho.
Yeah.
More than gung-ho.
Okay.
An interesting thing had happened. In about April of 1975, Maharishi was doing a world tour announcing the dawn of the Age of Enlightenment. And this was a time where some research had come out that said that when 1% of the population of a city meditated, the crime went down. So his inauguration for the south of the United States was in Atlanta, Georgia. And I wanted to go to it. And my father said, you can, but you have to be in school tomorrow morning. I mean, the next morning, you can't miss school. Yeah. So I flew to Atlanta, heard this research. There were some physicists. There were, I think, a Nobel Prize winner. And the next day in school, in one of my classes, it was an exercise we were given as a group. So I think it was like $500,000 metaphorically to solve problems in the world. So, my group was like struggling with things. I said, well, there's this thing called TM and it lowers crime rate. And this is how we could solve the problems. And I went to a very progressive school. So people were coming up to me in the hallways going, tell me about this. Tell me about this. So now you have a little ego, boost as a kid. Also, at that time, the people who were learning TM were like the physicians, surgeons, and I was a kid who were telling them what to do. So when they came in, I would say, now go here, sit here, take your shoes off, do this, do that. And they were doing what I asked them to do. That gets a little bit heady. So I was more than gung-ho. And I had gotten virtually everyone in my family to learn to meditate except for my father. And including our parish priest. So anyone that my parents sent me to talk to, or to talk me out of going, I got involved.
Yeah. Interesting. A little thread of connection there is that my ex-cult leader used that research to speak to us about the provability of meditation, and that basically the scientists are now proving something that the yogis and wise men have known from the beginning of dawn.
Yeah. So this research that's done, I refer to this technique of research as painting the bullseye around the arrow. So what would happen is when 1% of the population of the city would reach meditating, they would look around and say, okay, accident rate went down. I'm just making up these examples. and hospital admissions went down. But in another city, crime rate would go down. So they would say, this is what happens when 1% of the population meditates. The next time they got a group of people or reached that thing, maybe crime rate would have gone up. So then they focus on something else. So it's painting the bullseye around the arrow is the research.
I thought you might have something to say about that.
Yeah. So I went to the university. I'll just take a couple of minutes. And the university taught in a unique system of one course at a time. So my professor for marketing came from Harvard with his Harvard's curriculum. My professor of physics came from CERN in Switzerland. Likewise, throughout these things, there was a core faculty, but there was they were able to bring in very well-known professors to teach courses because they were one at a time for a month. So we would go to school and take academic courses it was much like Brigham Young University. A Mormon university. We wore suits and ties. We were celibate. We were cleaner than you could be. American. And then at some point, Maharishi had announced that people could learn these supernormal abilities, like levitation and the likes. And that sounds crazy to most people, and it sounded a little off to me. But the people who were coming to tell us about it were Nobel Prize winner, famous people. And so they said that they had just come back from Switzerland where it was being taught, and they were flying, levitating through the air. And so I signed up for this. I signed up. It was a course. It was 3 months long, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. Basically, our eyes were closed about 20 hours a day.
Wow. I didn't realize that. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the university would have 2 months of academics, then a month of what was called Forest Academy. Concept idea was you were in the forest, but you're really in your dorm room. And so for every third month was a month of rapid increase in the amount of meditation, focused on Maharishi's knowledge. It was 7 days a week. You were assigned a buddy to go to the bathroom alone, watch TV, read newspapers, call home, write letters. It's intense, and then back to academics. So in a 5-year period, I spent 18 months doing that in month and 3 month long blocks.
Wow.
And so that was a wild experience because when we learned to levitate, it's a long story about the whole structure, and Joe can talk about that too. But ultimately, we were taught this technique. It was highly secret. We were in rooms that had been security guards. We were at the doors. Our badges were shown to the security guards, which were our friends. And then you go through another set of doors where more people were checking our badges. Then we would sit in rows, and each row had a leader, and they would check our badge. And then people came in with books, and they had pictures of everybody in a row. And it was over and over again checking, which was trying to tell you that this was secret knowledge. And then wires were put through the rooms with earphones. And then there was a tape played of Maharishi teaching us how to fly.
Okay.
So we learned this technique. We went back to our dorms, which were covered. We had rooms covered in foam rubber. And there was 25 people in my dorm, and nothing happened when we were doing the technique. And immediately we began to think of things like, we had to be in bed by 10 o'clock at night. One night I was up at 10:01. I ate pizza one time. You started reflecting upon these things that you had done, because why weren't you flying? Because when we went back to the larger room where there's about 350 people, there were people saying they took off and they started flying. But 3 days into this, I was on one side of a room, and the next thing I know, I hit the wall on the other side, and I just zoomed through the air. My body was violently shaking. I was screaming at the top of my lungs. It seemed like a cross between Invasion of the Body Snatchers and The Exorcist 2, but it was a very powerful experience that drove this.
Yeah.
So that led me down a path of more commitment. We believed it just to this extent that people were sent into war zones in Nicaragua, Mozambique, Iran, I think, to stop wars by doing this. I wasn't one of them, but friends were.
Yeah.
I graduated from the university. I got a job in Philadelphia. I came here, and Maharishi at that time wanted us to create what he called Siddha, perfected people, villages, little communities. That's where I met Joe, and we moved into a very marginal area, and our friends. We bought maybe 10 houses, 12 houses. They were $1 to $7,000. And we created a community on the street. And then we had a business. We had a lot of employees. We had stores. I was on a path. And Joe's has an intersection here in this story. But to quickly get how I got out of all of this and into the work I was in, is that my dad called me and he said, "Pat, your sister has joined a cult." And I have 4 older sisters. And I said, "Yeah, Dad, I know. She's a crazy Christian nut." And he said, "Well, I'm asking you to come talk to her. Everyone who brings up anything about the group, it was the Way International, she removes, she cuts out. And the only person she hasn't cut out is you and your older sister." And I said, "She's crazy, not Christian. I'm like an outstanding Hindu, and I don't want to talk to her." So I agreed, and I went back to Florida. My father had all these books about cults, and he said, "Pat, there's things in here that are negative about the Maharishi. Those chapters, we don't agree. So don't look at those. You read about the Way." So the first thing I did was read about what they said about PM. And somehow, I don't know how, I got this idea of how to talk to my sister. And we were at a restaurant where we brought up the subject of her group. And I told her that I knew somebody in Philadelphia that had been a member of this group at a very high level. And I think that would behoove her to come talk to her. So we got on a plane, we came back to Philadelphia. And so in my house, in my living room, a woman came in who was an interventionist, and she began talking to my sister about how influence works, controlled, hypnosis, on and on. And I was sitting there going, that's what happened to me. And as this person was talking to my sister, explaining how this Christian group was manipulating, I was going, more and more, that's what happened to me. So my first intervention was when I was still in a group. This is the short version of it. And so that allowed me, that intervention, to ask questions within myself, not of anyone else, but to ask questions that I would not allow myself to ask. Wow. And so that asking those questions led me to a conclusion that this was a fraud, that the people who were friends who were hurt, people who had died, committed suicide, had mental health issues from meditating. I sort of got angry. I was young. A young guy, was full of energy. And ultimately, I sued the Maharishi and the university in federal court in Washington.
Oh, wow.
For fraud and for negligence. And Joe also did that, and he'll tell you his story. But it was during that process of suing that we encountered some of the people that you might know: Margaret Singer, Jolly West, Robert J. Lifton. A number of these people were the experts in our cases.
Oh my gosh.
So we had a unique opportunity to work with people that were sort of the people who founded in this modern time intervention kind of work. That's how I started. So my first intervention was in 1983. So now I'm going into my 40th year.
That is incredible.
And there's just one other thing that's sort of funny to me is I realized I hated doing the business I had, which we were at an import company, and I was at a gift show. It was in the gift industry in Minneapolis, and at the same conference center, I had to sell $100,000 that weekend of our product. There was a seminar for Christian healers. And the lobby, these rooms were people were standing and they were being touched on their head and they were falling down. And I literally just left our booth and I went and just watched this. And I was so fascinated with what makes these people experience the things they experience internally that cements this commitment. And I asked the guy across from me, "Would you like to buy our company?" Because I just can't do this anymore. And that's where I started. That's quite weird.
May I ask, I'm curious, Pat, when you talk about the flying experience and having had the experience that you had toward the end where you you flew to the wall. What do you make of that now?
Well, people do not fly and people do not levitate. At that time, the literature that was published by the TM movement said levitation, and it was described as the body lifting up, moving 6 foot forward, and gently coming to the ground. And so a bit of hallucinations were taking place in those kinds of rooms because I saw people fly, and I have memories of seeing people fly. These, of course, they're false memories because no one can fly. When we sued the Maharishi in federal court, the TM organization tried to, well, they did it. They went to get restraining orders against me and Joe and a number of people because we told them that we were going to go public with what it really was. And so it was interesting. I think we were on a court on a Monday, and we were making our case in federal court, making our case of why they shouldn't enforce these non-disclosure agreements. This is ancient knowledge. And the TM movement was making their argument. And the judge said he would give his ruling, I think it was the following Monday. And I think it was that Saturday, like 5 days later, the TM movement held the largest press conference in Washington, D.C. history in the convention center and announced the first yogic flying competition. So they changed the name from levitation to yogic flying, and they did a public demonstration. So it's kind of, they just reframed the experience. So most people who learn now don't think about levitating, but that's what we were told it was. So it's that experience I had to understand, why did I shake? Why did I scream? What was going on? And that's what Margaret Singer really helped me understand. During this preparation for lawsuit, she was my expert on a specific thing in terms of harm from the amount of meditation we were doing. And she asked me in an interesting way about what I knew about hypnosis. And she said, do you think that maybe TM could be hypnosis? And I said, oh, no. Being a TM teacher, this is not hypnosis. This is actually, it's the opposite of hypnosis. She said, really? And there's my colleague, Joe Zimhart, was with me in Berkeley. He was at a conference and he came to pick me up. And when he rang the doorbell, he came in the room and he said, why is Pat laying on the floor? And Margaret said, well, he thought he couldn't be hypnotized, and he has a particular talent for going into very suggestible states. And so what had happened is I told this to Margaret, and she said, well, what if, I said, I don't even know how people hypnotize people. And she started telling me a story, and then I ended up on the floor. And so she said, you have this talent of going into this suggestible state. And that suggestible state is also tied to creativity. So they're like, go hand in hand, but it's something you have to become aware of. And she really wanted me to experience it. And even though I had quit meditating and I was no longer connected with the organization, I was still having what some people might call Kundalini experiences, or bolts of lightning and my body shaking at the weirdest times, like in a movie or having dinner. My arms would start flying and jerking around, and I couldn't figure out what was causing it. And she helped me identify that in these flying rooms, there was a lot of hyperventilating going on.
Yeah. And
we figured out that I had unconsciously married the sound of with this experience. And so every time, not every time, but when I'd be in a movie and someone would sigh, or at a dinner, it would trigger this response. So Margaret taught me that by learning to label what was going on, that it would help it go away. And so that it was just interesting for me. That's sort of my path out, and a way of looking. We could talk for hours about.
Well, that's fascinating, and I think I'm very grateful for you sharing that, because I think this gets into the nuances of what the general public maybe doesn't have. It just isn't privy to, right? It's information that unless you've studied it, you wouldn't know about it.
No.
Yeah.
The thing with meditation is quite interesting. As teachers, we knew there was adverse effects because we had procedures to deal with the adverse effect. So when someone had obsessive thinking, obsessive thoughts in meditation, We had a procedure as a teacher to deal with it. When their body started shaking, we had a procedure for dealing with it. So if we had procedures to deal with things, they obviously knew that these things happen to people. And so what it turned out, some of the research, most research on meditation has been done by TM movement affiliated researchers. Most, not all. But what I found out was there was a number of researchers that had written about something called relaxation-induced anxiety, RIA. The two big researchers were Moravec and Hyde at the University of Kansas, with studies at Stanford Research Institute, University, in Pittsburgh, I forgot what university there, the German government. And they all found about approaching 40% of the people who practiced mantra or passive relaxation techniques had this opposite effect, where anxiety increased and didn't decrease. And the longer people did it, the more it happened. And I happen to be one of those people. Now, the TM movement provided me a theological understanding of why that was happening. So the theology, was there's 3.5 billion lifetimes you would go through to be from being a spark to being a god. And I better go through the suffering in this lifetime. But most people who learn meditation that have these adverse effects just quit. But it's those people who have locked into the theology can have these problems. So it's not, my mom meditated until she died. I would check her meditation. I helped lower her blood pressure. But myself and two of my sisters would become anxious, uncomfortable. It was not, we're just wired. And this is one of the things that Margaret taught me, is that we all need different types of techniques. And she said that a therapist, if they were dealing with you, a trained therapist, would be looking at the approach that was being used, the technique or the therapy process, and adjust it for an individual. But when something's a religion that claims it's not a religion, like TM, what they're doing is applying a technique evenly to a whole group of people. And it's the same for everyone, and they're not taking into account individuality. And so she pushed me onto that I should be doing active relaxation techniques, which would be like lifting a weight, feeling your muscles. She said, don't do rhythmic things. No Stairmaster, no running, not bicycling, but lifting weights, doing things like that would get you in touch with your body. And then I became much more relaxed. But prior to that, I was one of the people that had this relaxation-induced anxiety. So for me, it's just not, it wasn't healthy. And we also have to admit that I probably meditated, 20,000 hours, so, or 10, 20,000 hours at least. So it's a little bit different than the average person, the 10 million people who learn TM who come in. They may have been lied to or whatever. They paid a lot of money. That's okay. But there's an inner core of people that graduated from the university or were teachers, and that's not that many, less than 50,000. And so I think these are very different groups of people.
Yeah. And this, I don't know if we table this for a little farther down our conversation or not, but this actually was a conversation or question that I was curious to ask the two of you around kind of the changing of a group, and now, of course, our listeners probably who are familiar with TM, they probably have, some of them might be going, oh, is this the same TM? What does TM look like? Am I in trouble? And so, I know for myself, even just when I was living in New York a few years ago, I encountered many people who had taken the introductory TM courses. Sure. Of course, my husband, who was in the cult with me prior to joining our cult, he also did TM. My brother has done TM.
It was considered the gateway this is Joe Kelly. It was considered a gateway movement for many who were interested in alternative beliefs because it did present itself as mainstream. I mean, the fact that Merv Griffin and others like Mary Tyler Moore in the 70s movement is quite different from the 2023 movement of transcendental meditation. So they've learned over the years not to make extraordinary claims, although the claims they make now are still based on those initial claims that they made back in the 70s. So there are many people that are gaining some benefit from relaxation, but aren't in the hardcore center of the movement that we were involved in back in 1973, 74, 75, 76, when it expanded from a group of people who had been familiar with Maharishi from the Beatles, not knowing that in 1969 they left the Maharishi under conditions of suspicion. Sexy Sadie, the song from the White Album, the Beatles' White Album, is about Maharishi. So they were already raising suspicions about him. And yet we still, in 1973, 74, became dyed and hard and true members based on our belief that the scientific research proved that it wasn't just merely a mystical path, but it was something that could benefit mankind and could be proven scientifically, which was what Maharishi wanted to show to the world. And so when I sat next to one of the well-known physicists from Harvard, and he was sitting on the phone next to me, I assumed that he was, giving a nod of approval to this technique that would otherwise be considered to be absurd. When I started out, I was in the local TM Center in Philadelphia. It was a little different than Pat. Pat was in the belly of the beast in many ways. He was where I wanted to be. And I remember I went to Temple University and studied comparative religions in Philadelphia. And in order to put myself through school, one of my dear friends in TM, who's still a dear friend today, ran a vegetarian egg roll truck at University of Pennsylvania and Temple University. I worked at that truck, and I was like the new age bartender. So in some ways, I was a clearinghouse for all the movements that were around in Philadelphia at that time. So I met people involved in people involved in Ananda Marga, people involved with Guru Maharaji, people involved with Muktananda. It was an exciting spiritual atmosphere. And yet I could stand within that group and know that we were achieving the highest spiritual goals through transcendental meditation and Maharishi's path. So that encouraged me to continue on to the advanced programs that Pat talks about. And he was at the university. I was what they called in the field. So I was in this I came from a blue collar family, Roman Catholic. And so the concept of a saint was not foreign to me. In fact, I was fascinated with the lives of saints when I was a child.
Yep.
And so when I reached puberty, I left all that behind and found what one would call the green goddess, marijuana, and a bit of mescaline, and the Moody Blues, and the Magical Mystery Tour of the Beatles. So all of that kind of funneled me into the direction of there's something more out there than Catholicism, the Catholicism of my family. And so I want to find it. I want to know what that is. And I was walking to the library one day, and there on a telephone pole was a poster of Maharishi inviting me to a TM lecture. And I went to the library, and there on the bookshelf of the top-selling books of that time was Jack Forum's book on transcendental meditation. Well, it was all falling into place. I remember grabbing that book, checking it out of the library, reading it on my way to Temple University, where I was studying the lives of Christian mystics, and thinking this is being offered to me in today's world and relates so much more than what I have been experiencing within the Catholic tradition. So I moved away from all that, attended my introductory lecture, had an experience at the TM Center, unlike anything I experienced up to that point. So that intimate moment of being given my mantra, which was a secret only to me, not to be spoken out, and never to be shared with another. So that secretive, specialness and holding this dear to yourself really impacted me as a young boy who was trying to find his way in a world. I wanted to be free of drugs because I was at that point realizing that wasn't going to fulfill me, and I was looking for a path, really. And TM presented itself as just that. And as I became a volunteer at the local TM center, I was surrounded by teachers and individuals who were fully committed, just a little older than me. So I would have been 19 and they were 25. They were wearing three-piece suits, and yet they were talking spiritual knowledge. I remember coming to them with my textbooks from Temple University talking about Taoism and Hinduism. When they said, well, Maharishi really has the right approach in his science of creative intelligence. So it's better to look there than to these so-called scholars of religion who have an old concept of spirituality as something where you need to suffer. And TM presented itself as offering 200% of life, 100% spiritual, and 100% material. So, I was being kind of shifted out of traditional notion. The Catholic saints were all, long suffering. A saint that get their eyes gouged out. They would be boiled in oil. They would be hung upside down. But they would find God in the end. And TM didn't require any of that. They said, Maharishi has honed it in on a process that's going to give you enlightenment in 5 to 7 years, if only you abide by his teachings. And they included things which weren't spoken out loud. So again, there was that group of us at the center who were those who had been with Maharishi, and those were the acolytes of those who had been with the Maharishi, that vegetarianism was a value, that you needed to be celibate or less sexual. And all of these things were kind of fed to you quietly and behind closed doors. The general public were teachers, businessmen, lawyers, judges, and I was involved with all those people as well, checking their meditations. And I would be this 19-year-old kid sitting there going through the process of TM checking to make sure that they were doing the proper practice. And they were going along with my suggestions. And I was kind of blown away. But I also met diplomats and, people so far outside where I had grew up in this. My father was a car mechanic. My mother was a housewife. There were 7 of us in the household. And yet I was meeting these people from another echelon within the TM organization. So it was not only, giving me the sense of spiritual development, but also, I can achieve something great here. I'm not just an ordinary boy from the blue collar ghetto. I can really do something extraordinary. And I began to have experiences in meditation that convinced me that I was on the right path. And I finally met my people. So I'd been to 12 years of Catholic schooling, very kind of rigid, and there were certain things expected. And yet these people were coming from another angle, and they felt more like they spoke to me. The message of love and peace and harmony was included in the TM message. And that was something I was dearly interested in. I went to one of the first BN ecology movement offerings in Philadelphia on Belmont Plateau, it was called. And we all hung out and, talked about peace and love. So that was a part of me, yet this movement was now giving me a way to express that in the world outside. So it was a very potent, rich environment.
It's interesting. Joe went through Catholic school and was interested in the lives of saints. I got kicked out of Catholic school in first grade, and was only interested in science. I had no idea what reincarnation was. I didn't know any of this. So when I went to the university, the day before I left, the teachers at the center told me, well, Pat, there's no, it's vegetarian there, and you're going to have to wear a suit and tie to class. And that's when I was exposed to these other realm of teaching.
That were strict.
And so we came in very, very strict. Maharishi told us that we're to throw our blue jeans in the Atlantic Ocean. We were never to wear blue jeans.
So I had a dear friend who was a really good meditator and a volunteer at the center, but he wore blue jean overalls like most of us did in the 70s. And he was told, they pulled him away in the room and said, oh, we so good, with the other people who come in and ask questions. And you really know your stuff about meditation, but you can't wear blue jeans. And the next day, he was in a button-down shirt and khakis. So the impact was there. We were on a mission to serve Maharishi and his goals, which were to bring enlightenment to the world. And that dawn of the age of enlightenment that Pat spoke about, I attended Maharishi's talk at the Felt Forum in New York City. He was in Atlanta, and he made the world tour, sharing with us that all we needed to do is get more of our friends and family involved in transcendental meditation, and there would be no more war. This whole Vietnam thing that we just all lived through would be a thing of the past, and the worries that we had about the Cold War in Russia would fade away because no one could rise up against an enlightened populace. So this was all part of the doctrine that was hidden behind that first level of involvement that most people didn't enter into. So it was a pyramid structure, a self-appointed messianic leader at the top, and different levels of information given out as you descended down that pyramid. There was no big commitment, but a lot of members at the fundamental level, at the primary level, and there were very few of us who were getting more and more indoctrinated into the secret knowledge that Maharishi was offering.
We call this the escalator of commitment. So the escalator of commitment is always there. That you're encouraged to sort of get on that escalator of commitment and go up. Most people don't. And when Joe was talking, I was reflecting that, he had a draft number. They just ended it because Joe's a little older than I am. It was a time where war was something that was real. The Soviet Union was in full swing.
My brother could have been drafted, my older brother. So it was a real thing. And, some of my older sister's friends had died in Vietnam. So, and my brother-in-law was a Vietnam vet against the war. So I went to my first rally with Jane Fonda in 1974. So this was all part of the milieu that we came from. And when TM presented itself as a scientifically verifiable spiritual technique to bring mankind to peace and enlightenment and harmony, I was all over that.
This is about 10 years out of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And growing up in Florida, my father being in the military, we had a bomb shelter attached to our house with 4-foot thick walls. I mean, it was not something, there were bomb shelters around cities. This was not something that was maybe, this was very lively and real. So the idea of world peace and stopping war was something in a very different context than we live in today.
The context is so important, really. It's very, very powerful. Yeah.
Gives us that entree into this new world that we hope has all the answers, or some of the answers, to describe a new reality, an improved reality than what we had come from. And TM presented that, and from there, along with Pat, we tried to create what was called in those days an ideal village, and I say that in quotes. Because it was a dead-end street in a marginal part of Philadelphia. Some would call it a ghetto. When my parents saw where I was living, my mother cried. And So it wasn't like we were all enthused because we thought we could do transformation. And we weren't afraid of what we saw around us. So there was this victim of Agent Orange Vietnam vet who lived down the street from me, who came up to me one day with a tire iron, stuck it up to my neck and said, "Help me change my tire." And I said, "Okay." So
It was
so this
it was
was a tough it was a
it was
tough
very
neighborhood.
it was very
But
tough.
the interesting thing is that today, that is an extraordinary little street. With we still have friends there, and we've never lost contact with this neighborhood that we now reside in.
Joe
And
talks about I'm sorry. Joe talks about his mother crying. My parents came to visit me, and when they got back to Florida, my sister called me and she said, "Where do you live?" I said, "I live in a, not a great area." And I said, "Why?" She said, "Because when he asked Mom what your neighborhood was like, all she said is he's happy. So we know there's a problem." A few months later, my father came up with a 28 gauge shotgun and he said, "Okay, son, this is where you're going to defend your house from." So it was not a great neighborhood.
But for us, we were so
Associated.
had so embraced Maharishi's ideal that we were certain we had the aura of protection, and that nothing could penetrate that. And fortunately, nothing really did, except for Guru number 2, who moved onto the street. And when the student is ready, the teacher comes.
Right.
So this had been, in my readings as both a student of philosophy and religion, and the readings of Muktananda and other traditional teachers, I thought, who had come to the U.S. and brought their point of view on spiritual growth. And so Muktananda was kind of closely aligned with TM in many ways. They both kind of claim to represent some degree of Shaivism, tantric Shaivism, and mantra meditation. Muktananda's technique was quite different, but they had a center in South Fallsburg, pretty close by the Transcendental Meditation Retreat Center in South Fallsburg, New York, where I attended many of my classes. So I read a lot of Muktananda's work. And when the Swami Prakashanand Saraswati, moved onto this little street, house next to house, and knocked on my door and said, "Would you like to come to satsang?" And here he was, orange robes, gray beard, long hair, seemed loving and sweet, and talked about God's love. I was swept away again, because what had happened in TM is it had become, in my mind, somewhat hardened and no longer had that feeling of kinship that developed amongst the meditators. So there was that sense of love was lost. There was no talk about anything other than science and politics and law and reason. And all of that kind of didn't speak to me any longer. But when Swamiji moved onto the block, about 50% of the people on the street started attending satsang at Swamiji's house, which was right next door to mine. And I can tell you that sitting him up on the couch and me sitting on the floor, I thought for the first time something overwhelmed me, and I felt, I'm enlightened. This, or he's giving me a taste of what enlightenment means. All worries had dissipated. All concerns were no longer, mattered to me any longer. And yet there was something that was so real and tangible that I became involved with the Swami. And that meant, doing something which I swore I'd never do. Once you found your teacher, you stay with the teacher. The guru requires that, and you'll be challenged along the way. So along with that, there was a group of us that were also former meditators who had decided to sue the TM movement and it became what was known as the Guru War. So Guru number 2 had encouraged a group of his followers to sue Guru number 1, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. And it was in that process of litigation that our attorney recognized something in a group of us, not all of us. Some of the people who were litigating were not involved with the Swami, but most of us were. There were 5 of us who were still very much involved with the Swami. And he said, you know something, guys, here's I'm going to make a suggestion to you all. In order to be able to describe your experience to a jury of your peers, you're going to have to use language that makes sense. If you are involved with another guru, you're not going to get much sympathy. And in a court of law, it's going to look like one teacher against another. So we're not going to gain much traction. What I suggest you do is attend a conference that has some of the experts on things called cults. And it was the Cult Awareness Network. So I attended my first Cult Awareness Network conference in Kansas City. And it was there sitting in a group of 35 ex-members. And I was certain that the culture of the Cult Awareness Network were fundamentalist Christians, and I was going to dismiss them out of hand. They knew nothing. And when I sat in that group, I found other human beings striving for the same goals that I was striving for. And yet they had been taken advantage of in some way. They were members of Christian communities. They were members of New Age communities. They were members of Hindu guru communities. And yet their message began to resonate with me. And it shook me to my core. And I was almost wearing a Joker smile that weekend. There was so much going on internally because I knew that what they were speaking was true. These were genuine human beings. They were not coming from bias or prejudice. They were coming from a place of true experience. And I had something to learn in that environment. And I attended lectures held, by Dr. Margaret Singer, other ex-members, some therapists, but mostly ex-members were the people that I began to bond with and relate to. And I realized, could this be what I find myself in? And am I not seeing clear of the things within group number 2 that I left group number 1 for? In other words, the guru in group number 2, Swami Prakashanand, was beginning to manifest some of the same issues that I found trouble with in group number 1. So I could see it clearly in transcendental meditation, but I was still somewhat overwhelmed by internal experiences that had dominated my awareness and justification for my involvement in group number 2.
We so hope that you enjoyed this episode. These podcasts were edited by Nathan Lemke. If you'd like to work with him, please reach out to me and I will put him in touch with you. And please stay tuned for part of Leaving the Cult, the season 2 song written by Jaya Suri, and for all things related to Jaya, her music, ways that you can support her, check out the show notes.